All right. Well, look, welcome everyone. This is the fifth event associated with the Sharing Schools, Building Communities exhibition, and really like to welcome you all here this afternoon for this lunchtime session on the second last day that the exhibition is open. I'd like to firstly just acknowledge country and the Wurundjeri people who have, of course, been the custodians of the land on which this event is taking place for thousands of years, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Unlike some of the other events we've held over the last 6 weeks, this one is much more of a conversation, and it also has a very international connection. And we'll introduce Deb McKoy in just a moment, who you can see here on the screen. The conversation is revolving around the theme of designing hubs with communities. The other events that we've held in keeping with the Building Connection Schools as Community Hubs ARC linkage project have dealt with issues about designing hubs as schools as community hubs, why hubs matter for communities, and also why hubs matter for schools. And today the theme is sort of extending into engaging with young people in particular about understanding their desires, their wants, and their contributions to schools as community hubs, and in fact, urban design and urban planning in general. As I said, we've got Deb McKoy joining us from University of California, Berkeley, which is wonderful. I'll introduce her more formally in a moment. But firstly, I'll just introduce friend and colleague, Associate Professor Ian McShane, who of course is here in person and I think known to quite a number of you. Of course, Ian is one of the Chief Investigators for the Building Connections project and is a Senior Research Fellow at the RMIT University Center for Urban Research. And his research has focused over a number of decades, I dare say, Ian, on both informal and formal education systems, especially museums, libraries and schools, as well as local infrastructure, community services and digital technologies. And really, my job here is to introduce you to Ian and then to Deb, and to hand over to Ian to engage in a conversation with Deborah. So Deborah, thank you so much for joining us. It's late evening in Sacramento, and we believe you had a really busy day. So we're extremely thankful for you giving your time. Deborah is the Executive Director and the founder of the UC Berkeley Center for Cities and Schools at the Institute for Urban and Regional Development. She also lectures in the Department of City and Regional Planning and the Graduate School of Education. So quite a multidisciplinary portfolio there. And her research and teaching focuses on the intersections of educational reform, urban and metropolitan planning, community development, and public policy. Her work is critical in terms of engaging young people in urban and metropolitan change and transformation. So we're really thankful for both you, Ian, and Deborah for joining us. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Ian, to converse with Deborah about the work that she's done. And I might interject occasionally because, of course, Ian's got a lot to share as well, and I might try and draw some of that out as the conversation unfolds. So over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and hi, everybody. And Deb, welcome, and it's terrific to have a chance to catch up with you again. You were a visitor to our centre in 2017, and it's partly your work that has informed the project that we're currently engaged in, and it certainly speaks to my interests of the intersection between education planning and urban planning. And that's an intersection that I think we've attempted to highlight isn't always at front of mind in policymakers. We tend to operate sometimes in silos in different policy domains. But I wonder, Deb, before we get into some of that, if you could tell us a little bit about yourselves, for those in the audience who don't know about you or the Centre for Cities and Schools, if you could maybe tell us about your background and how you ended up establishing the Centre for Cities and Schools.
Sure, and I have to say thank you so much, Ben and Ian, for inviting me, and hello to everybody. It was a really, really wonderful time in Melbourne and learning about the important work at RMIT. And I've been inspired by much of your work as well. So it's great to be in this hybrid event, which is sort of the new normal, which is wonderful that we could join. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think like so many of the students that we work with, I had anything but a straight path. I'm professionally and academically led by just pure frustration and inspiration, both perhaps. I'm a New Yorker and I love cities because that's where I'm from, and understood the world sort of through the lens of large cities. And the connections within those cities and the family and what it was like growing up on 75th Street. And so my work has never just been like I knew I wanted to be. I never thought I would be in academics. I never particularly liked school. But I got an internship when I was in college and at Berkeley, at SUNY Albany in upstate New York. And I fell in love with public policy. And I just met some great people. And my first job after college was with the Speaker of the House. So I learned a lot about politics and the power of policy. Fast forward 20 years, I had worked in nonprofits and I ran a refugee resettlement program, which was a really interesting lens into displacement versus place, which I spend so much time in now. And it's really still informed a lot of my understanding about the power of connection to place for our homes and families and what happens when you lose that connection. But I was never traditionally educator. I worked in public housing in New York. I continued to work for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, even when I was working at Berkeley, particularly in mixed income housing. And it was kind of funny because I was hired to look at the soft side of housing, which is about improving the quality of life, which, as you might imagine, is much harder than the bricks and mortar side of housing. So this interrelationship between the everyday life of young people and cities and housing in particular was really what drove me to graduate school and to study education, because schools were never at any of the conversations we would have with the mayor's office of New York and the housing agencies. And it was baffling to me. So 20 years ago, I came to Berkeley to understand this intersection. And here we are today, still trying to understand and make progress on and making policies around the interrelationship to really structure success for young people. So it's been sort of a fluid movement, and I was really fortunate just to meet amazing people in 2004 with my co-founder, Jeff Vincent, who works a lot in school facilities, and he was working with joint use at the time. And we said, we really have to bring together research and practice and policy to formally look at the relationship between the built environment and urban education, which interestingly never unpacks the urban. It's always still about, just school and classroom. So perhaps longer than you wanted, but that's a bit of the trajectory.
That's a fantastic background and really sets the context. And your work and Jeff's work were part of the reason why I began my journey as well. So there are a lot of synergies between the US and Australia, but thinking about the United States context and your interest in young person's experience of place and this intersection of city planning and public education, the US is very spatially and demographically diverse, but I wondered whether there are any national overarching characteristics that shape this relation between either the connection or the disconnection of young people, schools, and cities.
It's a very hard thing to generalize because our cities are so incredibly diverse. Most of my work has been in large urban centers from New York and now in the Bay Area. I think that the driving force of how non-inclusive the cities are, how segregated our schools are, which is reflective of housing segregation, is such a deep history of inequality and racial inequality in particular in this country, that there are just too many issues at this intersection to say one or another. But what's grounded a lot of our work is the incredible inequality within our school systems and the segregation within our school systems that are cemented so often in housing policy. So I think while we work with transportation and all different dimensions of our cities, this at the core of isolation is the isolation of schools for a number of reasons, right? Historical reasons about how the US has structured independent schools locally, more so than many places, hyper-local decision-making for school boards. It's created these deep gulfs between our cities and schools, particularly with low-income families and communities where we focus most of our work at the center is at that area. I'd say rural area reflects that division as well. But the displacement and which I think is true in cities in Australia as elsewhere right now with gentrification is really the dominant force driving such inequality, reflective of not so much the difference of people, but the difference of how our policy cemented, just these inequalities.
Yes, indeed. The connection of housing and schooling in Australia is very underdone as a topic of public policy discussion. More attention to the unaffordability of housing for teachers, teachers as essential workers. That's certainly emerging in large Australian cities. But let's talk specifically, Deb, about some of your work with young people. And perhaps a good place to start is to refer to your new book, Planning Cities with Young People in Schools, Forging Justice, Generating Joy. I wonder why you chose justice and joy as the main themes for the book.
One, I can thank the pandemic because it took me 20 years to write that book, and it took a pandemic to keep me home long enough to write it with my two colleagues. I think that there's no greater framework for what we learn from and with young people than justice and joy. It provides a theoretical foundation from an academic side. It was driven really by the literature. Just Cities is a large literature that we work from and align with, and that was pretty common or well known to the city planning and community at large, the academic community, as well as the inclusive equity community in doing the work. But the part that's so unique about what young people bring to our cities is this notion of joy, right? The closest that we get to and talk about in the book is happiness, and happiness as a goal within cities, which gets kind of laughed at a bit or not taken so seriously. But if there is anything that young people can inject into some of the most intractable, difficult conversations in our cities, it's that we all need and deserve a place to be happy, right? And that why don't we design for that instead of just livability? We have these framings and planning that kind of set the bar low, if you will, right? Young people push us to have far higher aspirations in and outside of school, right? Like we all want to be places where we love to be. And why can't classrooms be that way? Why can't the transportation and the way we get to schools be that way? And home communities. So justice and joy, I could probably talk about it for the next hour, but it really is truly a reflection of what young people bring to the conversation.
Yes, indeed. And so, Ben, this might be a good time to talk about a concrete example of some of your work, Deb, so that the audience can get a sense of just how you go about what you do, how you engage young people, and what they're interested in, what they're trying to achieve in their intervention in urban planning. You've been working on a project in San Jose recently, I understand. Is that something that you can talk to us about?
Sure, I would love to. And I'll share the story, and I can share my screen. And I don't know if you can see it on a small screen, but the project in San Jose around Vision Zero. But I also want to say, as a little preview, in the middle of September, in about 3 weeks, we're going to have a publicly available toolkit that will help anybody operate, any city or community or planner activate young people in their cities. After we wrote the book, we didn't want to just talk about the book. We wanted to provide tools for anyone to engage young people. So stay tuned. They're going to be publicly available tools on all of our 20 years of curriculum and strategies. And one of that is a showcase where we highlight over 200 different projects that you have a snippet of on the website. If I share my screen now, I can share one project in particular, as you mentioned, in San Jose, which is Vision. You have Vision Zero in Melbourne, don't you?
Vision Zero.
I don't know.
Oh, maybe not. Okay,
we did have a Project Zero group from Harvard a while back, but not a Vision Zero that I can recall.
Okay, that is different. So Vision Zero is an initiative that is somewhat of an international initiative to really address the role of cars and pedestrian fatalities in our cities. In New York, in many of our largest cities, it is the greatest reason, cars are the greatest reason for deaths and injuries. So as you might imagine, this is an enormous issue that is at the center of cities and the schools to keep them safe. San Jose is actually one of the highest rates of deaths this year because of car fatalities. The city, so we worked with a local, much like a community school, a local charter school, a bilingual school, called Escuela Popular, who partnered with the city in our methodology called Y-Plan, which stands for Youth Plan, Learn, Act Now. It's also a pun, which invites young people to ask why. Why are my peers? Why is it so dangerous to walk on our streets? Why can't my peers be safe walking to school? So the why is very important to our methodology. And so Vision Zero is where the city asked young people what they can do to improve safety on the streets around their school, which happened to be one of the most dangerous corners, if you would believe, in San Jose for pedestrian fatalities. This is a new tool that we're developing, story maps. I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly to show you a little of the data and a little of the recommendations and outcomes from the project. But I will share the link with you all. And if anybody wants to look more deeply at some time after the presentation, you're most welcome to. It tells you a little bit about the Y-Plan methodology. This is our 5-step process. As I said, we'll have curriculum and tools available to anybody if you want to use it in a couple of weeks. The community of practice, where the teachers at the school working with city leaders, the transportation department, who was also a former alumni, which was wonderful. Where other higher ed partners, the State University, San Jose State University is leading the local work there. And the core question was, how can we make it safe? How make walking safer in East San Jose? Again, I'm going to stick to the big bullets so we can engage more in dialogue. Students actually love spatial data and they love maps. So it's a wonderful tool to actually engage young people to both understand the problem, to situate themselves and where they live in this spatial context, and then start to develop solutions. This will tell you a little bit about the school. It's a wonderful community school. It's a small school. It is a whole family school. So there's adult learning and preschool there, which I know there's an interest in community schools. It very much reflects the tenets of community schools. These are some of the locations that were points that the city asked the young people to study. Again, these maps are fun as learning tools for young people, but a really great way to understand place. Some of the data that they collected. Surveys are a very important part of the Y-Plan process because it's often very hard where adult planners can't actually get youth data for child reasons. They don't have access, and there are protections, human subject protections against it. But teachers, when it's a part of the formal curriculum, love having students collect data. It's a great way to operationalize math and statistics. So they do maps, they do walking tours, and then they collect data through the survey. I'll just point to one. Do you think it's safe for pedestrians to walk on White Road? Again, you'll see it's a bilingual school, so language is really important and everything is translated. And of course, they don't feel it's safe. At night, they think about it. And most students drive because it's not safe. So of course, this got to issues of climate change and our environment and our the health air quality. So it dug into that area. That was also really important in thinking about transportation and walkability. Many of the students live within walking distance, which is typical, but they largely drive or are driven because of safety. And then there's some quotes from students. Again, I know I'm going through this quickly, and I can invite you to look at it after. Some of the students' recommendations in the short term were simple things. Planners often say that they love working with young people because their ideas are a lot more affordable than what many adults do at community engagement meetings. It's just that the lights don't work. It's as simple as just lighting very often, right? Which makes it dangerous. So replace the street lights, repaint crosswalks, really hugely important and impactful. Through the process, students learn many of the best practices about what actually creates safety, so they make informed, evidence-driven decisions. Some of the longer-term solutions were add street lights, pedestrian hybrid beacons, different types of way of thinking about space. Bike lanes, incredibly important when students would like to bike, but there is no way feeling that it's safe to bike. That you can actually change the physical infrastructure is something that is kind of blows young people's minds when they start working with the city and clients. So in terms of next steps and some of the impact, some of the greatest impact has been that the city has recognized the really critical role young people play in understanding this issue around transportation safety in the school, where they understand things from such a different and critical perspective. And they really need to address not only the way young people are saying to make the streets safer, but where. And they're really able to target what's often under the radar about corners where young people stay and if they want to play and just feel safe walking to and from school. So that's sort of a quick example through using our story map, and I'm welcome. We can dig in at any time.
I must say, and I might interject here if you don't mind, that there's also some work going on in the UK and also Sweden. Our new director of our School of Design here, Dan Hill's been directly involved in some of that. Very, very similar about making school streets much safer. So obviously this is sort of a global effort to make sure that, cars aren't dominating and, people can traverse safely to school and away, and all the additional benefits that come with that. Can you talk about, not just the sort of the transport benefit, but what else, might transpire as those streets become safer, Deb?
Less cars, right? It definitely gets to the emissions issue, and young people are more activated around climate than any of adults, right? So they're very aware of the need to stop using cars and not being so dependent, especially down in Silicon Valley where it's so car dominated. I think some of the other outcomes is that young people recognize that they have a role to play in the city governance and city planning process. So it actually makes the field of planning something that is possible and something that they could engage in. I think that some of the longer term implications are that we just have to really reimagine the relationship between our schools and how we consider sidewalks and streets both. The role of cars is so prevalent. Students they get driven, but this was a middle school that I shared with you. I should have shared, it was 8th grade, the students were doing this work. And their whole world is sort of navigating cars. So it really helps to lift up how young people experience different modes of transportation.
It is so resonant with discussion in Australia about walkable cities and city livability. But young people aren't really present in that discussion, it seems, in Australia. There's been very episodic interest in child-centred planning in Australia. It, seems to be an idea that has a career that comes around every, decade or two and then goes on the back burner. And I wonder if that's the case. I know you're a very firm advocate and a successful advocate in this area, but how does City Hall view this? How do planners see this? Do they listen to young people?
It varies, of course. Adultism is live and well in many of our city structures, of course. I think what's nice about doing this type of work is that the majority of architects and planners that I know intuitively feel like they would love to engage young people. I think it's almost a common sense type of instinct. The challenge is how. right? At Berkeley, at many universities, it's not top of the curriculum, right? It's not on the agenda about how we prepare our profession. We have an article, a chapter coming out in a book to really think about an equitable future is young people have to be attracted to the field, diverse young people have to be attracted to the field. So I think that that's just a really important way to think about it. I wanted to add something that was kind of connected to what the case study was. We talked about walkability with the young people, and they said, what about funability? What about playability? And I thought young people add a new way, a new language to think about decisions that we make in our schools. So I think I didn't answer your total question, so feel free to reframe it or ask again.
No, indeed. It's such a live issue in Australia, but I think it's still some way to go in terms of true engagement of young people in participatory planning. There were two other things that I picked up in your example there. The first was the deadly word infrastructure, and just how important it really is. And young people have got a completely different vision on what it means and what it represents and how they use it. But looking at particularly California and some of the work that you've been doing from Australia, the issue of investment in school infrastructure and the infrastructure surrounding schools in the precinct and the neighbourhood seems to have been such a difficult and contentious issue. And I wonder if that's something you could talk to us about. Why is investment in school and related infrastructure, social infrastructure at neighbourhood level, such a difficult political issue there?
I'm going to say something quickly, and then I'm going to reference everyone to Jeff Vinson's brilliant work on this topic, because he is certainly the national or global expert on it. I think one of the biggest issues, though, is that it goes to our history and that schools, the local nature of schools and in California really separate physical structure from general education. And when we think about funding schools, there's an old saying like a good teacher can teach in a shoebox, right? And I think it's one of the most devastating things because the same kids are in those shoeboxes and they're not typically kids of privilege, right? They're kids who don't have the family communities that don't have those resources. So I think that there's a core issue about how our school finance system has driven a lot of the understanding about school facilities and about the prioritization and the assumptions about who deserves to have high quality physical environments and built environments, and unfortunately who doesn't. Jeff Vinson's work has really been trying to lift up the deep role of equity about how these decisions are made, but they're often very formulaic. They're often based on numbers. They're not based on equity. California finally started changing the school finance system so that there's some driven equity around English language learners and low-income families and foster students getting more money in the local budgets. But that still hasn't largely been in how we allocate school funding. The last thing I'll say, and I really am very humble in this area, is that very often school funding is generated by local bonds and not general funding. So local communities and fancy communities say, sure, we'll put more money into bonds. And then in other more limited communities where they're, in more low income communities, bonds are harder to pass.
Yes, school financing is a very different beast in the United States than it is in Australia. Another thing I picked up from your presentation was the community school. And that's something that has been on the policy agenda in California and elsewhere in the United States, and probably has a different meaning than what it does in Australia. Focusing on the school as a community hub, as we are in this project, has different terminology, different policy settings, different social and cultural and demographic settings around the globe. But what does the community school mean in California? And why has that come onto the policy agenda in recent times?
Sure. Well, one, I'd love to, I wish I could see the exhibit behind you on the wall and see more. And I'd love to hear more about how it is being interpreted in Australia. I can share a bit about the community school. It started with full service community schools several decades ago with Joy Dreyfus, a professor who was looking at public health and that the need to really understand our school environments from a public health standpoint. It has grown largely over the last 20 and 30 years, but still largely from a service model. It's actually not a physical model. It's really talking about community services. When we talk about community schools, it's a very important part of what we need to do for all schools, which is to level the playing field by making sure that students have a healthy environment, have access to health clinics, have access to many other aspects of their lives, whether it's food students get in schools, but just all aspects to a healthy environment and healthy services that allow you to learn. It's sort of setting the conditions in our school so that all young people can learn, right, in the classroom and outside of the classroom. What's been kind of amazing at the local level or in California, but also the federal level, has been a massive recent investment. $3 billion was just passed. It's going to be implemented over 7 years in California for hundreds of schools through planning grants and implementation grants to build out new and build on existing community schools. Again, it's not a physical construct. It's more of a social phenomenon about how do we call wraparound services to really support learners. One of the key ingredients, if you will, of community schools, and that was key for this funding, was just providing a local coordinator. Researchers found that makes all the difference, that if teachers have to do all of these referrals and get involved in case management and how we think about getting the students to the services that they need, it doesn't happen. So this funds a coordinator for services to really provide those wide range of opportunities and services that the students really need. So it's unfortunately not very much a physical dimension, which you would think about from planning, but I think that might change. I think that, when you throw so much money like this, a lot of architects and planners could get more interested in how to design more from this framework.
Yes, the partnership broker, the facilitator, the coordinator, somebody who's not on the teaching staff but is on the school staff, has emerged as a key issue in those types of environments in Australia. I wonder, Ben, if this might be a good time to open up for questions and ask the audience if anyone has any questions for Deb.
Absolutely. While people might be formulating a question in their mind, it's interesting you say that it's sort of more of a social phenomenon, this sort of new community schools funding, Deb, and I guess that's why we started the research project that is hosting today's event, recognizing that there's all these intentions, these aspirations for schools to do more and to offer more, but where does that happen? Mm-hmm. What's the role of the facilities, and how might they do double or triple time in terms of being multi-use, during the school day and outside hours? They may well have other purposes, and how do we get efficiencies in that? And so that's really has been the sort of the central tenet of the research, is what's the role of facilities in those enhanced relationships.
And I should say, and thank you, that's actually a critical role. It's it's maximizing school facilities for all of these very important services for young people. So it certainly is an alignment of the school facility and social services that young people need, community services that young people need, what happens before 9 o'clock or before school start and after school start. I actually worked with Beacon Schools, which was one of the really early models of community schools in the South Bronx when I was still in New York in public housing. And they weren't allowed to use school buildings, right? This has changed a lot over the last couple of decades, but thank you. That's a really important point. It's the utilization and more efficient and effective utilization of school buildings.
Ian, I might ask you on that issue of, public policy and where we're needing to see some developments. Deb, you mentioned that some schools haven't been allowed to share their facilities. You know, some of the survey work we've been doing, people in different areas and different jurisdictions around our country have also said that. You know, we'd love to, but the policy frameworks won't actually allow us to do that. And what do you see as sort of the areas for policy development that we need to be really concentrating on here?
Well, we could start with the structure of federal government in Australia. It was interesting, Deb, hearing you talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of the local level administration and funding of schooling. That doesn't happen in Australia, as I guess you know. Schooling, compulsory schooling, is provided by either state education authorities or non-government education authorities. The local jurisdiction has very little role in education, some in early childhood care and education, but it's a very weak jurisdiction. And I mean, if I were redesigning government in Australia, I think I'd strengthen city governments and the local government sector for a range of reasons. Firstly, I think it would attempt to overcome this gap between education planning and urban planning. And I think looking ahead at some of the challenges in the 21st century, it's city governments who are advancing the climate change agenda. It is city governments who are largely more receptive to the dramatic upsurge of political interest by young people in, for example, the climate strikes. There are a number of state-level politicians and national politicians in Australia who told children to go back to school and learn more science as one of the very caustic responses to school strikes. So I think that, you know, there is a role for strengthening the local jurisdiction in Australia, being aware that you know, that can bring with it problems of equity and diversity across the sector. The Australian sector is quite diverse in terms of its high level of privatisation of education, but we have found some interesting examples, contrary perhaps to perhaps popular view, that in fact the non-government sector is very engaged with local communities and very attuned to sharing their facilities and providing place-based and community-based services and so forth. At a state and national level, I think there's great diversity amongst Australian states as to the availability of school facilities for extended hours use. The fences go down in some states and the fences come up in some states. Perhaps, you know, a more determined national and state level agreements around that area. And finally, funding. Schools are often cash strapped. The idea of putting additional staff on, such as the partnership broker or the coordinator, is something they may not be able to countenance. Who pays for the extended use of the facilities? Do the space and design requirements align with the kind of services that are required? They are conversations that need to happen across jurisdiction and across the different areas of public administration in Australia. But it's certainly a conversation that has developed substantially, particularly as with rapid urban growth in the outer areas of Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane, and a realisation that governments will no longer be prepared to build standalone community facilities. They are much more interested in multi-purposing and interested in the sort of service connections that can be made when you bring a group of professionals together from the health domain, from the housing domain and the education domain. I think that that's been a strong conversation in the last decade or so.
Deb, can I ask you in terms of what changes you've seen perhaps over, say, the last decade and where you think more change will come? What's exciting you about the opportunities that you sort of see sort of gaining momentum, if you like, in your part of the world?
Yeah, well, I think that is beginning to change. To Ian's point, I think that folks are thinking through a lot of the research that's happening through Jeff Vinson and others who are looking at innovation and how that leads to greater efficiency, honestly, right? Not to use all of our buildings to the most is just ridiculous. So I think people are excited about thinking about that. Relationships between cities and schools are changing. Under the last couple of federal administrations, there's been more incentivizing in federal grants to align community planning, city planning, and education. So I'm hopeful that there are more incentives at state and federal levels to really shift some of the local decision making. You know, we just have very traditional, in too many communities, we have so many traditional understandings of what a school is, right? Which I think the pandemic actually has shifted somewhat. I'll just say quickly that one of the most interesting things that happened was, I think the role of school buildings in young people's and families and communities' lives was vastly underestimated until they closed. When schools closed, everyone became shocked about how many students eat at school, how many students get healthcare at school, all of these invisible forces that are so important in young people's lives, I think might inspire and catalyze some real change moving forward. To break down these silos and not only align service delivery and education, but really think about the form and design of schooling as well.
Absolutely. We totally agree with that. Having endured the longest lockdowns in the world, it became clearly apparent some of the roles that schools, as you said, have been quite invisible to people, but became really clearly apparent. We do have, we've got a microphone too into the audience, which is great. So we'll throw to this question. Thank you.
My name is Marwa. I am a mother and also studied architecture, and I'm recently been employed as a community. I also live in a public housing, and it took me basically 8 years plus COVID to be able to be connected to the community. And that's when I started working as a community member. So if our public housing are designed to be isolated, don't we need to, how can we be involved in the community? Don't we need to change the housing system first?
Question.
They'll be able to hear the question?
I think so. About public housing and how do you change the system? I think the only way to change the system or to transform the system is through diversifying engagement. I will say that it's really important in the work we've done over 2 decades that young people's engagement is only 50% of the equation. The other 50% is adults having to learn to step back and learn to listen and then act from what they learn from community, from engagement with young people. So it is, I think, harder, if you will, for professionals to change what they do, to change the status quo of how they do the work and what they do, as much as it is to actually create these spaces for young people. But we're not going to change systems unless both young people and adults are provided ways and opportunities to learn from and with each other. It sounds a little Pollyanna, but I think it's really, really true.
And if I can perhaps pick up on the sort of the line of questioning there, Deborah, I think we've seen some examples in California, and we've got some sort of recent examples actually in construction here in Melbourne of sort of new public housing or sort of affordable housing in amongst new developments and schools being developed together. Can you talk about that in the Californian context?
Sure. I mean, and I'm sorry, that was your more direct question. So thank you for redirecting. It's getting a little late here. I think that I actually have done a lot of work on particularly around federally and locally funded housing and affordable housing with schools and kind of co-location, if you will, to really foster more of a community school connection. It's not easy because the systems are so separate, but I think that there's, particularly at the elementary school level, there's a lot of movement to recognizing that schools have to be a part of an ecosystem in a neighborhood, and you need to think about that in the planning process, particularly around public housing. You know, in public housing in the US, you may know, has a very, very deep racial, very divisive history. In fact, many have talked about it and written about it as American apartheid. So public housing's racial divide is a lot to overcome. And in terms of my work, breaking that isolation is critical, and schools can play a critical role, again, particularly elementary schools, mixed income schools, and really thinking more intentionally about breaking the segregation that was largely often created by these large public housing developments. I could talk for another hour about that, but if that gets to more of the point, I do think it's hopeful, but it's not sufficient. It's not how developers, it's just so hard to think about schools, honestly. It often makes them go a little like, what? It's hard enough to get a building built in California, let alone think about schools, which are so hard to build because of earthquake protections and so forth.
Well, we don't really have to deal with the earthquake issue, but we do have to deal with the other issues, that's for sure. I think probably we're just sort of nearing the end of the conversation. Just checking there's no other questions here. And Ian, maybe, kind of final words or thoughts from you about, sort of the scope of what we've talked about, or some of the things we might not have mentioned.
Deb, one thing I'm really interested in is, and I think you touched on this at various points of your talk, at least alluded to it, is the sort of educational cycle of suburbs and urban districts where schools are seen as schools for schooling and have limited other uses. I'm really interested looking forwards at issues around adaptability. What happens when the demographic of neighbourhoods changes and the cohort of young people who the school were built for has moved on? In Australia, at least in Melbourne, part of the response has been to close schools and sell the sites. And we now have the situation where the state government has acquired up to 10 new sites in inner Melbourne to build schools because of urban repopulation. The issue of the adaptability and the wider use of school facilities, is that on the agenda in California or anywhere in the US, or are schools simply seen as for schooling?
The vast majority of development is still schools as schooling, as you say. That being said, I think that the forces of demographic shifts are going to incentivize rethinking the relationship. Suburbs have changed. It's no longer just middle-income families, right? It's shifted. They're diversified. Large immigration communities are becoming the majority in a lot of our suburbs. And I think that's going to drive a lot of change in the necessity of types of services that are needed, and a way to reimagine sort of what's happened in the urban core is happening a lot in our more metropolitan type of framework and thinking about suburbs. So I think that there is hope. School closure is another whole area. It's a huge area of scholarship. That's not my specialty. There are a lot of planners that are beginning to look at it. Ariel Bierbaum, who used to be at Berkeley, has done a lot of work looking at what happens with school closures and how urban planners often play a role in school closures that had no intention of driving those decisions. I can tell you, where I live in the city of Oakland, it is one of the most divisive issues today. And I say that as a parent as well as a professional. So you could have a whole other session on school closure. It is so divisive that people don't realize, again, the importance of the school until you try to close it. And I've seen many superintendents pushed out by choice or by the community because of their decision. We have so many vacant properties in Oakland that it's decisions had to be made to close, but it is so painful, the choices that have to be made, really pitting community leaders against school decision makers. So I don't want to end on that note. I think there's a lot more hope happening.
If you turn it around, it sort of does indicate very strongly the great value that schools provide to communities, and to close them helps them perhaps realize that, and it can be a very sad moment. But also, if you look at it on the flip side, the extended value, which actually Ian and I were conversing about today, that sometimes the narrative about schools is, at least in Australia, very strongly associated with sort of academic outcomes and less so about some of the more sort of integral parts of that school play in communities and supporting the social fabric of society. I think probably we've sort of reached time, unless Ian, you've got any other comments.
No, it's been delightful to engage with you again, Deb, and to give us an international preview of your toolkit, which we look forward to.
We very much look forward to that and to picking it up and perhaps implementing some of those ideas and to take some of the ideas from the book as well. So
Yeah,
look, those of you here, if you wouldn't mind just sort of thanking both Ian and Deb for joining us, really appreciate the time you spent, and thanks for staying up into the evening to speak with us, Deb. We really appreciate it, and we hope to continue the conversation with you over the next months and years. It's been really good. And Ian, you might want to say one last word.
No, thanks very much for coming along, and thanks, Deb. Lovely to chat with you again, and look forward to more conversations.
Likewise, look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody. Good day.